Thank you. I'd like to introduce Kilian Moote, who's going to be our guest today. Kilian is a director at Humanity United. Humanity United is a foundation dedicated to bringing new approaches to global problems by building, leading, and supporting efforts to change the systems that contribute to problems like human trafficking, mass atrocities, and violent conflict. In this role, Kilian works extensively with businesses, investors, and policymakers to identify and address social issues within value chains. He led the creation of Know the Chain, which informs a network of investors representing over $5 trillion in assets on what the largest companies are doing to manage their supply chains. Kilian also advises Humanity United on strategy. Kilian, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. It's great to be here.
Kilian, could you share just a bit more about your role at Humanity United?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And the way I've really approached my role in my career is through a vocation that operates at the intersection of purpose and profit. So I've worked with large Fortune 500 companies, but I've also helped launch mission-driven businesses as well. And whether you're a large publicly traded company or you're a small startup, you really have to have an understanding of how to navigate the interconnected nature of your business, of investors and the public sector. And that's really where my expertise and focus has been. And I've applied that to the approach and the work that I've done with Humanity United. I don't fundamentally think there's a single approach that companies need to take or the public sector needs to take when addressing these complicated and complex interrelationships. But I think it's really important and strategic in what I've brought to my work is really how do you kind of continue to adapt and iterate and understand all the different ways in which you might be intersecting with these different vital components that make society function overall.
One of the areas that I know you've done a considerable amount of work in is around supply chains. And there's probably never been a time in our history, or recent history anyway, maybe during World War II and the fact we had to have coupons to buy things like gasoline and certain food items. But in recent history, there hasn't been as much awareness of the supply chain that I can think of, certainly in my lifetime, than there is today. Thinking about that, what is the impact of this new awareness of the supply chain that the coronavirus has created for us? How is that affecting the way people think about the supply chain and about your work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Steve, and it's one that we've been reflecting a lot on. A lot of our work and our strategy is about addressing issues or problems within highly complex systems. And there's no time like now to really focus globally on what that means to have these globally complex systems that exist. For a long time, supply chains have developed really after World War II. They started to kind of accelerate, and you saw that acceleration exponentially increase after the end of the Cold War. And now, any product that you consume likely is made up of multiple different components in which even the corporations that are selling those goods don't have visibility largely beyond their first tier, let alone upstream all the way to the raw materials. And so what really this moment has really shown and exposed to a lot of individuals is how vital supply chains are to their everyday life in ways that they didn't previously know. And what we're seeing is obviously acute impacts at that first effect, but really what we're seeing playing out as well in supply chains is second, third, fourth order effects within the supply chain. And that really gets to the point about this complex systems that we've built to serve the economy and serve consumers and serve businesses. And so what I mean by that is, let's take, for example, the garment manufacturing industry, just as a case example, right? You saw this huge shock in demand from consumers, as well as a shutdown in production in certain regions. What that has done is it's led to a ripple effect all the way up the supply chain. So we're seeing in Bangladesh up to 4 million workers kind of getting laid off, and that industry itself really contracting because of this acute shock in the system. That then is leading to a second order effect in which raw materials and input suppliers are no longer receiving the orders that they're receiving. And that's going to lead to a third order effect in which that's going to affect the demand for raw materials like cotton and other components. So that's going to continue to ripple and throughout this entire system. And I think what we haven't fully appreciated is the the efficiency, the global supply chains that we've built, really that compromise that we've made where we want efficiency, we want just-in-time production, we've sacrificed this idea of visibility, and we've sacrificed this idea of resiliency. And that acute shock right now for supply chains, I think, is really highlighting for us, you know, how to retool or rethink about vital components to how business intersects with society and intersects with public policy as well.
This sort of complex web that we've created, and you know, the fact that it's so difficult really to know as a company every aspect of your supply chain, you know, from the actual production of the metal that you might need to mining it from the ground to the component that you eventually, or the system that you eventually receive. But you have been very effective at helping companies recognize where in their supply chain issues are happening, and have been working with government and other agencies to really help expose some of these things, and having an impact on forced labor as an example in your work. My question is, are there some lessons that we can take from what you've been able to do in kind of linking together government and private industry and the NGO collaboration into actually impacting other global challenges that we face?
Yeah, I think one common theme that has really been highlighted to a lot of individuals, I think, at this point, is some of these issues that are globally complex, they're a real shared challenge. And so where we end up engaging in the work that we do is not necessarily solely with individual companies, but it tends to be with associations, or it tends to be with a group of companies. And I think in particular, what we're seeing in this time and moving forward, I think it's going to be even more relevant, where you have these real shared issues where, you know, whether it's an automaker in the US or an automaker in Germany, largely there's kind of a shared dependency on their supply chain. And therefore, if there's a problem in the supply chain, if there's a problem with the existing kind of industry structure or the structure of the firm itself, that's going to have an impact on all of them. And so you can really create this, this, I would say, like, healthy tension between these different competitors who normally wouldn't come together and say, this is a shared issue that affects us all. It's pre-competitive in some nature. It really impacts our ability, all of us, to operate. And so you can kind of create that space to open up in which you normally wouldn't see it occurring. I think that's one lesson that we're seeing. I think another thing that we've seen emerge, and that we think in our work, not just with supply chains, but in dealing with companies in general, is that because of the age of globalization that we're in, and I think there has been a lot of conversation about supply chains as a national security related issue, and you might see a little bit of a retrenching and investing in supply chains domestically. That will happen. I think that is one impact that we're going to see from coronavirus. But I don't think you're going to unmake globalization. The reality is that we've got an efficient market, and labor will continue to kind of adapt based on where those cost centers are and how companies can compete globally. And so therefore, global forums, whether it's the United Nations or the ILO, or who knows, some kind of new iteration or adaptation of that kind of structure, is going to continue to be very vital. We engage a lot in those conversations because it does really set the terms and the standards and creates the rules by which these systems are actually governed. So I think for me, in thinking about lessons learned from our work and how it might apply, is those are really the two things that come to mind for me. Is, you know, how do you create these pre-competitive spaces where normally industry competitors or even suppliers and buyers can come together and talk about shared problems that they have, and then how do you strengthen or establish new multi-sector spaces in which you have governments, NGOs, and companies coming together and saying, how again are we addressing some of these interdependent and challenging issues that we're all connected to in some way?
You know, one of the things that struck me as you're answering that question was, you know, that we have this thing in business that we call co-opetition, which is basically the combination of being a competitor, but also at times having to cooperate and have a kind of a unified front on particular issues. And you're kind of talking about this as kind of this idea of co-opetition and more of a grand scale to help us understand our supply chain connected and be able to begin to address that. Is this idea of co-opetition something that is then relevant to global challenges as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we take a step back and look at this moment that we're in, I would say there's kind of three interconnected crises that we're experiencing. One is obviously the health crisis, first and foremost. The second one is the economic crisis that a health crisis is leading to. And then the third one, which has been with us for a while, but I think is acutely relevant for us to be thinking about, is the environmental crisis that we're experiencing as well. And so if you take those three crises and you see them for what they are, which is a global moment that everyone in the world in some way is impacted by all three, you do need to figure out what that response is and how acutely individual companies and sectors are affected. It's going to vary, and it's going to vary over time. We're seeing some food suppliers in the U.S. right now in this moment, beginning mid-May, that are impacted at the moment, right? What is the second, third, and fourth order effect, and how long is that going to play out for that industry alone is really hard to really know at this moment. I think that does again call into question the need for these global discussions in global spaces by which these shared problems can really be dissected and analyzed. I think it's going to continue to manifest in different ways, and I think if we were ever as a global community going to have an opportunity to come together and discuss this and discuss what the role is of the public sector, what the role is of the private sector, and what the role is of society to address some of these things, now is that moment, because we're all acutely affected by it in some way.
And to follow on that point, Kilian, what would it require? I mean, who needs to take the leadership position in making that kind of a conversation really happen, making it reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think the private sector plays a vital role. I do. And I think there has been, and coming from a US centric perspective a little bit, there has been an orientation, I think, over the past few decades to think as the public sector as solely the referee and solely as the one that is enforcing specific policies, not as a market creator. And I think if you think about public policy in a different way, you say, look, there's two functions that government plays, right? It does play the let's create rules and enforce rules, but it has historically also played a fundamental role in catalyzing market development as well, catalyzing what is next. So it's not solely about regulation in a negative sense. It's also about creating new opportunities. And so I think when we're forward looking in this movement and we say, what's this going to look like? What is the next iteration of interrelationship between business and the public sector? It is really kind of reconstituting that and saying, how are we creating kind of incentives for collaboration that's going to lead to greater market growth and support greater stability in society as a whole. I also fundamentally believe that this can't be led solely by a company. I think it needs to be industry level initiatives for a variety of reasons. I feel strongly about that. I think the challenge then becomes, how do you kind of create those dialogues and how do sectors kind of step as a whole and where does that kind of leadership come from? I think you're going to need to have some very strong leaders as individuals, but they need to realize that to really go far and to see the change that we need, they need their entire industry to come. And so they really should be not solely focused on, how does their business show up in this moment, but how does their industry and how do they as a leader kind of lead from behind and push their entire sector forward and not be so focused about them being the one that's going to create the solution to this problem, because it's a multifaceted issue and you kind of have to come at it from multiple different vantage points with multiple different perspectives.
One of the things we've been exploring in these interviews is the way that the aerospace and defense industry might play a kind of important role in helping address global challenges. And sort of the underlying assumption there, underlying thought there, is that this industry in particular has had a lot of government funding. There's technologies that have been developed in some cases for very complex systems that for a variety of reasons exist but have not been unleashed or liberated into the market, and also because of the ability of the engineering capability and thinking about things from a systems of systems perspective that exists in that industry. What are your thoughts about the role that the aerospace and defense industry could play in helping, play some important role, or what kind of a role would you see them playing in trying to address these global challenges?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Steve, particularly in the U.S., DARPA has been a very effective vehicle and mechanism by which investment into technology has occurred, right? And so even things like the internet that is so widely ubiquitous and dependent on our society globally today, in some way was kind of started as supported through public sector funding. And so I do think that is a fundamental role. And we really need to unlock that innovation to say, look, we're not solely driven by right now commercially viable technology. What we really need to figure out is what is the technology that is transformational. And then, yes, at some point, as you scale that out, you need to figure out how to make it commercially viable. I think there's a lot of opportunity too in that kind of not, I would say, a new public-private sector paradigm, but I would say maybe getting back to the original intention of what public and private sector really meant, which is public sector is meant to benefit the entire public interest, not solely individuals or not solely individual governments. And so how do you get back to those original ideas of the public-private partnership, and how might you see that as a real catalyst for change moving forward? So I think, if you look historically back at different times in which we've had significant and acute global or U.S. crises, you see this real opportunity to shift the paradigm. And the two that come to mind is, obviously after World War II, the impact that happened and how that shifted the way that the global order operated and the things that were created out of it, like the United Nations, the original, seeds that then eventually led to the European Union. I think those are good examples of kind of a rebirth and a recategorization of what's needed in society. And then similarly, after the Great Depression here in the United States, you had the New Deal, right? And what did that lead to? That led to significant public investment into that then flowed into private projects and public works, but funded through funding that then went to private industry to build things like our national park system or build, our continental interstate highway system. What are the things that we're going to need moving forward, or what are the opportunities that might emerge that allow for us to unleash some of that technological capability, particularly in the context of the U.S. or Europe? We could see huge investments in green technology, or you can see huge investments into things like 4G and really creating a larger connected infrastructure for what we might need moving forward, not for where we are currently today.
Yeah. You paint a very compelling picture about how this may be a point in time that could be a catalyst for leading to some large scale change. Kind of following along that line of thinking, how do you think the post-pandemic world will be different than it is today?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really fascinating to see how this moment has really accelerated some trends that were already occurring. It feels like overnight or over two months, which really in the grand scheme of things is virtually overnight, this rapid digitization of certain businesses and certain industries that might have actually gotten there over a few decades, but that happened in months. And so I'm thinking specifically of that distribution model of food, whether it's restaurant orders or it's grocery orders. That kind of thing has happened rapidly overnight, that what might have taken us as consumers and as business to kind of shift over a multi-decade period of time. Similarly, the idea of working from home, how quickly so many businesses adapted to this work from home structure, and what is that long-term impact going to be, in which you're seeing already some companies, including Twitter, saying our employees never need to go back to the office. That has second, third order effects on cities. It has effects on us as in society. Those are I would say I'd put those in kind of a positive transformational trend. You're also seeing some more negative ones, right? Where the ILO came out and said half the world's workforce is likely going to be impacted economically by this situation. The UN came out and said 2 billion people are likely to slip back into poverty. Those are, again, kind of trends that we were seeing, this growth and inequality. It's just been accelerated by 2 decades. So I think those global shocks are going to lead to this season of renewal. And I think we can look to the past then to say, well, in what ways might that season of renewal previously have led to some serious kind of new paradigms for us globally? It's really hard to know which way that's all going to unfold. For us in our work and the approach that we take would be very kind of what we would say is like emergent. So in an emergent strategy approach, you're constantly looking and learning and trying to understand what are the signals that you're seeing that give you a sense of the direction that we're headed. And how do you adapt strategy? How do you adapt business process to respond to that kind of emergent trend? And so I think particularly for leaders, both public sector and private sector, taking that approach in this moment and creating this space to say, what are the signals that we're seeing that might lead us to an understanding of what that future state might look like, and really trying to develop out a strong foresight practice. Because I think there's a lot of different scenarios. You could see this season of renewal, and you could see things like a new deal in the US, or some kind of new global structure or renewal of the importance of things like the United Nations. But you could also see degradation before we get there, right? So you could see an entrenchment of nationalism in certain countries that then also has effect on business. You could see this kind of increased inequality that's going to happen as well. And it's really hard to know in this moment right now which of those paths, or if any of them, are going to emerge. It's also entirely possible that we could be sitting here in 6 months and we're back to business as usual. And so it's really hard. And so I think for us, we're constantly kind of learning, adapting, and trying to figure out what are those emerging trends that we can continue to follow to really figure out what this new paradigm will look like in the coming decade to come.
Yeah, and this new paradigm, however it plays out, we will still have some very significant global challenges that we have to address. And you're sort of suggesting that we need to sort of understand how we're responding, how we're adapting to the current crisis, and that will help us understand the best pathways to take as they emerge to move forward in addressing some of these issues. Do I have that right?
Yeah, you have that right, Steve. And I think just tying this back to the point about the global complex system that we operate within. A solution today to a problem might be an actual problem in the future. And so specifically, I'll give you a very pointed example from my time when I lived in San Francisco and had done some work, and had the privilege of actually meeting Jack Dorsey, the founder of Twitter, early on. And Twitter was being hailed as this great democracy tool in which individuals who were living in oppressive societies and cultures could get their voice out and could organize and could talk about their rights issues. And we were holding that up as a bastion of hope. And it very much was at that time, and it was helpful. But I think what we failed to realize is the ways in which that technology could also be used to distort or to potentially harm. And any technology is a tool. And so as we think about this time, we can look towards solutions and we can figure out ways to use these things. But I think it's fundamental for us to realize that in a highly complex and adaptive system, you have to constantly reassess, and you have to constantly be thinking, in what ways is the system itself and the complex interconnected relationships, how are they changing and adapting? And how then, therefore, am I, one node in that globally complex system, needing to change and adapt my own approach? And so I think hopefully what we can take away from this moment, whether it's this season of renewal or this season of maybe a prolonged winter, that we all come out of this, whether we're in the public sector or the private sector, of just having a stronger awareness of how interconnected we are to each other, and the ways in which we need to adapt and respond when these different crises emerge, or when these different impacts begin to kind of show up and arrive.
Kilian, I want to thank you very much. Very insightful interview. Appreciate it.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve.